When I returned home to find my garden mysteriously erased, I thought it was an HOA dispute, until the woman behind it froze at a fine in her own name, and the truth of her obsession finally bloomed. The first thing I noticed when I came back from my trip was not my luggage pressing into my palm or the sun beating on the back of my neck. It was silence. Not the gentle, Sunday afternoon kind of silence. This one felt wrong. Too heavy. Too deliberate. No bees weaving their lazy circles in the air. No fragrance of jasmine drifting from the trellis. No splash of roses leaning rebelliously over the fence. Just the brittle sound of gravel crunching beneath my shoes as I walked up the path. My garden, every flower, every herb, every stone path I had laid with aching knees and dirt under my fingernails, was gone. In its place, bare dirt, a flat expanse of brown, uneven soil, dry as bone under the late afternoon sun. I froze on the sidewalk, suitcase dangling from my hand. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I'd taken a cab to the wrong address. My house stood there, the same pale shutters, the same crooked mailbox, the same little crack running along the left corner of the steps, but stripped of its soul. The heart of this home had always been the garden. Without it, the house looked hollow, like a body without breath. I dropped my suitcase. It hit the pavement with a dull thud. I didn't bend to pick it up. I just stood there, staring, feeling the sting of disbelief. Was I dreaming? Had the week away bent my mind so completely that I was hallucinating? I took a slow step forward. The familiar creak of the porch steps should have comforted me, but it didn't. Each groan of the wood felt mocking now, as if the house itself knew a secret I didn't. When my shoe met the soil where the stone path used to be, I felt my chest seize. The stones weren't there. Not one. Gone as if. Swallowed whole. My lavender rose gone. The old hydrangea bush gone. The bird bath my mother had gifted me, the one the sparrows loved gone. Everything erased. The dirt was freshly turned, not even weeds daring to break the surface yet. Whoever had done this hadn't just ripped things out. They had leveled it, smoothed it, made sure there was no trace of what once lived here. It wasn't neglect. It was intention. My throat tightened. I had poured years into that garden. Hours before work, hours after, weekends lost to pruning and planting, dragging bags of soil, arguing with roots that didn't want to take, coaxing life where the earth once resisted. Each plant was a story. The roses had been stubborn but fierce, pushing their way through season after season, a splash of defiance against the HOA's frowns. The jasmine vine was my pride, its scent spilling into summer nights, a perfume that clung to my skin and hair when I sat outside with a book. The rosemary and thyme were more than herbs. They were part of my cooking, part of dinners with friends, part of every small ritual that made this place a home. And now dirt. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. My eyes burned, though I told myself it was just the dust. Movement caught my attention. A sliver of blinds snapping shut across the street. Then another, 2 houses down. They were watching. My neighbors, silent, faceless shadows behind glass. They knew. They knew what had happened here, and none of them had said a word. I turned slowly, scanning the street. The world was too quiet. A dog barked once, sharply, before being shushed. A car rolled past, but didn't slow. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the block itself was holding its breath. I wanted to scream, to pound on doors, to demand an answer. But my body wouldn't move. I just stood there in my own yard, or what was left of it, feeling like a trespasser. Then I noticed something. Near the porch steps, half buried in the dirt, a sliver of white. I crouched down, brushing away soil with trembling fingers. My nails filled with grit as I uncovered it. A plastic tag, the kind you'd find at a nursery. Words printed in black. Property of Green Hills Hoa. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up at the empty yard again, and for the first time since arriving home, the numbness drained from me, replaced by something sharper, darker. Anger. Not wild, not screaming, but cold, controlled. The kind of anger that waits, sharpens, and does not forgive. I stood slowly, the tag clutched in my hand. Neighbors' blinds shifted again, the faintest flutter of movement. They were still watching, still silent. I didn't wave. I didn't call out. I turned, unlocked my door, and stepped inside my house. Behind me, the empty yard stretched like a wound. But inside me, something else began to take root. This wasn't over. I almost didn't see it at first. The sun caught the edge of the paper, and it fluttered faintly in the breeze, the strip of tape struggling to keep its grip against the wood grain of my door. A letter. It looked so ordinary, one sheet of white, folded once, taped crookedly at eye level. But even from the sidewalk, I felt its weight. I climbed the steps slowly, suitcase wheels bumping behind me, every movement magnified by the silence around me. My heart beat harder with each step, as though my body knew something my mind hadn't yet accepted. When I stood in front of it, I recognized the mark at the top instantly. The HOA logo, bold and smug, a perfect little emblem of control. 3 houses in a neat row, a tree planted just so, a line of fencing circling them. Community standards, they called it. Conformity, I called it. The letter was brief, cold, official. Per violation of community standards, your unauthorized garden has been removed. Do not attempt to replant. That was it. No explanation, no appeal, no apology, just a command. My eyes dropped to the bottom, where a signature should have been, but it wasn't signed by the board. Not by the president, treasurer, or secretary like their official notices always were. It was just one name, Karen P. The handwriting was sharp, aggressive, the ink pressed so hard that some letters nearly tore through the page. It wasn't the tidy, bureaucratic script of a clerk. It was a statement, a slash of authority, almost gleeful in its cruelty. I held the paper closer. The pen strokes cut across with such force, I could almost feel the anger behind them. Each loop and cross felt like a wound. My breath hitched. Karen, of course. The neighbors called her HOA Karen behind her back, but never loud enough for her to hear. She lived 3 houses down, her porch always swept, her shutters always freshly painted. She ran the HOA like a dictatorship, showing up uninvited to point out. Chipped paint, measuring grass height with a ruler, leaving passive-aggressive flyers on doorsteps. And now she had reached into my life and torn out the heart of my home. The words burned into me. Do not attempt to replant. Not you may not. Not this garden violates Section X. It was personal, a command aimed at me alone. Something twisted in my stomach. I glanced over my shoulder. Blinds shifted again across the street. Someone was watching, waiting for me to read it. Maybe they knew Karen had done this. Maybe they had seen her, shovel in hand, directing landscapers while my garden was ripped apart. Maybe they even agreed with her. My hand trembled as I tore the paper free from the tape. The rip of adhesive against wood was loud in the stillness, a sound that seemed to echo down the block. I folded the letter slowly, carefully, as though it might cut me if I moved too fast. My palms were damp. My pulse pounded in my ears. This wasn't just about flowers. This was about control, about erasing something beautiful because it didn't fit her narrow, rigid idea of what belonged. I thought of my jasmine vine, cut down and tossed aside like a weed. My roses uprooted, my herbs destroyed, my mother's birdbath smashed to dust. Karen had declared war, and she had made the mistake of signing her name. I didn't want to believe the silence was deliberate. At first, I told myself it was just bad timing, that my neighbors were busy, distracted, too polite to intrude on what they thought was a private matter. But after the 3rd unanswered knock, after the 4th window shade snapped shut the second I looked up, I knew it wasn't coincidence. They were avoiding me. I walked from house to house, the sidewalks that had once felt familiar now stretching out like hostile territory. Every doorbell I pressed seemed to echo too loudly, a sharp sound against the stillness of the block. My suitcase was still sitting by my porch, abandoned, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Not yet. I needed to know why. Finally, on the corner, old Mr. Delaney cracked his door open 2 inches. His pale eyes darted past me, scanning the street before meeting mine. Mr. Delaney, I began, trying to sound calm. Do you know what happened to my garden? His lips pressed together. His hand, knotted with veins, tightened on the doorframe. For a long moment, I thought he would slam it shut. Then he leaned forward, just enough for his whisper to reach me. "Karen runs the board," he said. His breath smelled faintly of stale coffee. "Don't fight her. Everyone's scared." The words sent a chill down my spine. Scared? Of what? I pressed, lowering my voice. "She's just a woman with a clipboard and a title. She can't." But the door clicked shut before I could finish. His lock slid into place, with a finality that made my skin crawl. I stood there staring at the peeling pane of his door, my mind turning over his words. Everyone's scared. Scared of what? A woman obsessed with power? A neighbor who spent her evenings measuring lawns and counting trash cans left out overnight? But the deeper I thought about it, the more it twisted inside me. She hadn't just removed my flowers. She hadn't just cut down vines or dug up roots. She had stripped the soil itself, scraped it raw, left it barren as though she wanted to erase even the memory of growth. It wasn't enforcement. It was punishment. I turned slowly, letting my gaze sweep across the neighborhood. Curtains fluttered shut. Eyes disappeared from windows. The streetlights flickered on though the sky was still pink with dusk. The silence felt thicker now, heavier, as though the whole block had been warned not to speak to me. Not about Karen. Not about what she'd done. My fists clenched at my sides. Something was wrong here. Something deeper than one woman's hunger for control. Karen didn't just want compliance. She wanted obedience. And if my neighbor's fear was any indication, she had already taken far more from them than flowers. That night, I didn't sleep. The house felt hollow without the garden outside my windows, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw only dirt. I paced the living room, the glow of the street lamp cutting stripes across the carpet, until finally I pulled out the thick binder of HOA bylaws from the shelf where I had shoved it years ago. It was heavy, the kind of weight that wasn't just paper, but bureaucracy pressed into 3 rings. I dropped it on the dining table, and dust puffed into the air. The sound echoed in the silence. Page after page, I flipped through rules written in bland, lawyerly language. Fence heights, trash can hours, approved paint colors for shutters, the width of a driveway, even the allowed wattage for porch lights. But no gardens, not one line forbidding them. My throat tightened as I traced my finger down the margins. I turned another page. Still nothing. My eyes blurred, but I kept going. If Karen had ordered my garden destroyed, the justification had to be in here. But the more I searched, the clearer it became. There was no rule. None. My pulse picked up, thudding in my ears. The realization burned in me like a fuse. She hadn't just bent the rules. She had ignored them entirely. I shoved the binder aside, papers sliding out in a messy heap. If anything, my garden had once been celebrated. I remembered the clipping, yellowed with age, tucked into a drawer in the kitchen. A feature in the Maplewood Chronicle. Residents' native garden conserves water, draws wildlife. There had even been a photo of me kneeling in the soil, hands covered in dirt, smiling like a fool next to my wild roses. The community had praised it. I had received handshakes, compliments, even a letter of recognition for promoting sustainable planting. So why destroy it now? The question gnawed at me as I opened my laptop. Midnight light glared from the screen. I logged into the county's online property database, a slow, clunky system designed to frustrate. Still, I pushed through, searching my address, my parcel number, zoning codes. Hours slipped by. The clock ticked past 2 in the morning when I found it. A single line buried in a scanned PDF from 30 years ago. My property, my yard, was part of a state-protected habitat zone. The words pulsed on the screen, stark and undeniable. My breath caught. I clicked through pages of legal jargon, cross-references, environmental codes. The designation was clear. The land was recognized for its native wild plants, its soil composition, its importance to pollinators. And those wild plants I'd nurtured, milkweed, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, weren't just flowers. They were officially documented species, protected under state law. Karen hadn't just ordered a garden removed. She had ordered a habitat destroyed, without a permit, without consultation, without legal authority, which meant she hadn't punished me. She had broken the law. For 2 weeks, My yard lay barren under the summer sun, a scar where life had once bloomed. The soil baked hard and cracked, each fissure reminding me of what had been stolen. I watered nothing, planted nothing. I let it stand as a monument, a wound made visible for all to see. Every day, Karen strutted past like a queen surveying her conquest. She slowed her pace at my fence, her lips curling into a smug little smile, as if my silence confirmed her victory. Sometimes she carried her clipboard, sometimes her little dog on its jeweled leash, but always she carried that smirk, the satisfaction of a woman who thought she had won. I never gave her the satisfaction of a word. I simply watched from my window, waiting. On the 14th day, the sound came, the low rumble of the mail truck's engine, the squeal of its brakes as it rolled to a stop in front of my house. I glanced up from my coffee, already knowing. The carrier stepped down, a stack of envelopes in his hand. But this time, there was one more, a stiff white envelope with green markings. I recognized it instantly. Certified mail. And fate, with a touch of dark humor, put Karen in the street at that exact moment. She was mid-strut, her sunglasses flashing in the morning sun, when the carrier called out, "Certified delivery for Karen P. Need a signature." She froze. Her smirk faltered, but pride made her cross the pavement quickly, her heels clicking on the asphalt like a gavel. Neighbors stirred. A curtain twitched. A door cracked open. People knew something was happening, even if they pretended not to. Karen scribbled her name on the scanner with a sharp, impatient motion. Then she tore open the envelope right there in the middle of the street because she couldn't resist the performance. I watched from behind my blinds, heart pounding. At first, her lips curled as if ready to sneer. But then something shifted. Her eyes flicked back and forth, faster and faster. Scanning the page. Her grip tightened, knuckles white. Her smile drained. The paper trembled in her hands. She blinked hard, once, twice, her posture collapsing under the weight of the words. Her face, always flushed with authority, turned pale as chalk. I didn't need to read the letter to know. I had seen to every detail myself. The state had fined her. Not the HOA. Not the board. Her, personally. The violation bore her name, in bold, unmistakable letters. Karen Prescott, responsible party for unlawful destruction of a protected habitat. It hadn't been easy. Filing the complaint, digging through county records, sending copies of the bylaws, the photographs, the old newspaper article that proved the garden's ecological significance. I had documented everything, compiled it neatly, pressed send, and waited. Now, the reckoning had arrived. From my window, I saw her sway slightly, as if her heels had grown unsteady. She looked around wildly, as though seeking someone to blame, someone to scold. But the neighbors who had once scurried from her glare now stood in shadows, watching. Their silence wasn't fear this time. It was something else. Satisfaction, perhaps. Relief. Karen pressed the letter to her chest and turned sharply, nearly stumbling as she marched back to her house. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply sipped my coffee and let the silence wash over me. Because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. It all clicked. The pieces that had once seemed scattered, petty rule changes, her smug smiles at board meetings, her endless parade of warnings and fines, suddenly aligned into one sharp picture. Karen hadn't cared about the HOA rules. She hadn't cared about the neighborhood, the manicured lawns, the forced uniformity, the constant pressure to conform. It had never been about community. It had been about control. And my garden, in all its wild, living beauty, was the one thing she couldn't dominate. The flowers had bloomed without her permission. The vines had grown without her say-so. The bees had come and gone without filing any HOA paperwork. To her, it wasn't just plants, it was defiance. It was freedom in a place she ruled with a fist disguised as a smile. So she hadn't just tried to erase plants. She had tried to erase me. But now, standing in the middle of the street, the sunlight exposing her pale face as she read the letter, I realized something profound. By trying to destroy me, she had destroyed herself. The fine was not small. It wasn't a slap on the wrist or a warning to be tucked away in a file. It was a citation from the state's Department of Environmental Protection. The words on that letter carried weight. Personal liability. Not the HOA. Not the collective. Her name was etched into the violation like a scar. And worse, the penalty was not limited to money. It came with the promise of legal action, of investigation, of public record. For someone like Karen, who thrived on image, this was death by paper cut. The neighborhood began to buzz in the days that followed. The same people who once crossed the street to avoid looking at me now whispered in hushed tones as she passed. Conversations stopped as she drew near. Doors closed a little quicker. Curtains twitched more often. At first, I thought it was my imagination, that maybe I wanted to believe she was finally vulnerable. But then it started happening openly. One evening, as I was pulling weeds from the corner of the bare soil where my garden had once been, a neighbor I barely knew slowed his walk and leaned toward me. His voice was almost conspiratorial. "You beat her," he whispered. His eyes darted toward Karen's house, and then he quickened his pace, as if being seen talking to me might put him on some invisible list of enemies. I didn't answer, but the words sank deep. It was true, not in the way I had expected. Not with shouting matches, not with fists pounding on tables at HOA meetings, not even with lawsuits. I hadn't out-argued her. I hadn't out-fought her. I had simply outlasted her. My garden's absence was a wound, but it had also been my shield. And now, the state had done what I never could. It had exposed her, stripped her mask away, and left her trembling in the street. But Karen didn't collapse, not right away. She tried to hold her ground, to twist the narrative. At the next HOA meeting, she stood at the front like she always did, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, her pearls resting neatly against her collarbone. But there was a tremor in her voice as she called the meeting to order. "Good evening, everyone. I know there have been misunderstandings about recent events, but let's stay focused on what matters, preserving the integrity of our neighborhood." Her words fell flat. No nods, no polite murmurs of agreement, just silence. Then someone coughed. A man in the back, a retiree who had once supported her every vote, raised his hand. "Karen," he said, "is it true you're personally being investigated by the state?" The air snapped like a live wire. Her face tightened. "That's an exaggeration. It's being handled." But the room didn't buy it. The veneer had cracked. For years, she had been the authority, the final word, the one no one dared challenge. Now, her authority was bleeding out in front of everyone, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. More voices rose. "We lost a part of our neighborhood when you destroyed that garden. You fined us for our shutters, but you think you can break state law without consequences? Maybe it's time someone else runs the board." I watched it unfold from the corner of the room, my arms crossed, my heart pounding. I hadn't spoken a word, hadn't raised my hand, hadn't even needed to defend myself. Karen was unraveling under the weight of her own arrogance. Later that night, as I walked home under the streetlights, I realized the victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had felt her tyranny, but had been too afraid to say so. The whispers had turned into voices, the voices into questions, and the questions into demands. Her downfall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single fiery explosion of humiliation. It was a slow, methodical collapse, the kind of ruin that happens when truth finally seeps through the cracks. And for me, it was more than vindication. It was clarity. The garden had been more than flowers. It had been my quiet rebellion, my reminder that beauty could exist even under rules designed to suffocate it. And though she had ripped it out of the earth, she had never uprooted its meaning. Now, as I looked at the barren soil, I didn't see emptiness. I saw potential, because gardens grow back, and tyrants do not. The letter from the state had arrived 3 weeks earlier, neat and clinical in its envelope, yet carrying the weight of a sledgehammer. It declared, in language stripped of any warmth, that the actions of the HOA president were under investigation. It cited codes, statutes, and violations I had never known existed, but each one pointed at the same truth. Karen had crossed a line that no position of power could shield her from. When the HOA board announced an emergency hearing, The neighborhood buzzed like a hive unsettled by smoke. Flyers had appeared overnight, taped to lampposts and slipped into mailboxes. Mandatory HOA meeting attendance required. Everyone knew it wasn't optional. Everyone also knew who it was about. That night, the community hall, normally a bland, half-used room where we voted on fence heights and trash schedules, felt like an arena. Folding chairs scraped the floor, lining up in rows that filled too quickly. Old Mr. Henderson, who never came to anything, shuffled in with his cane. The Morales family brought their teenage sons, their eyes wide at the chance to witness neighborhood history. Even the silent types, the ones who usually melted into their yards and avoided conflict, were there. They weren't going to miss Karen's reckoning. Karen arrived late, deliberately, as if timing could bend perception. She wore a sharp blazer, her hair perfectly set, lips painted in a shade meant to declare victory before the first word was spoken. She carried a thick binder pressed against her chest, bulging with tabs and highlighted pages. To the untrained eye, she looked prepared. To anyone who knew better, she looked desperate. The board members sat at a long folding table draped in a white cloth, papers stacked unevenly in front of them. At the center sat the state investigator, a man named Paulson, whose presence radiated calm authority. He wore no suit, just a collared shirt and a badge clipped to his belt, but the weight of the government rested on his shoulders. He shuffled through his file with the kind of patience that only comes when you already know you hold the winning hand. Karen cleared her throat and launched into her performance. "Neighbors," she began, her voice pitched to carry across the room, "what has happened here has been grossly misunderstood. The removal of the so-called garden was an unfortunate miscommunication, not malice. I acted to preserve property values, to protect all of you from an eyesore that had begun attracting complaints." She paused, letting her words hang. "And now, I'm being unfairly targeted by bureaucrats who do not understand our community." A few heads nodded, but most stayed still. Eyes darted, not toward her, but toward the investigator. They wanted to hear what the man with the papers would say. Paulson stood slowly, adjusting his glasses. He didn't raise his voice, but his words cut through the room like clean steel. "Mrs. Connors," he said, looking at her, but holding the room, "our investigation shows that you authorized the removal of private property without board approval, without the necessary permits, and against the state's homeowner protection statutes. The contractor you hired has confirmed that you gave the order personally." The room stilled. Karen's jaw tightened. "That's not true," she snapped. "The contractor misremembered or misunderstood. I had verbal approval from board." Paulson held up a sheet of paper. "Board minutes from that month show no vote, no motion, no discussion. Furthermore, your signature is on the work authorization order." He placed the document on the table, sliding it forward so the front row could see. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's face flushed crimson. She tried to rally. "These are lies. Fabrications. This investigator is twisting the truth to make me into some kind of villain. But ask yourselves, who benefits from this narrative? Who has been stirring discord, demanding attention, acting as though the rules don't apply to them?" Her eyes swept the room before locking onto mine. 100 eyes turned with her. For a moment, it felt as if every chair, every wall, every breath pressed in on me. But unlike the months before, I didn't shrink. I didn't drop my gaze. Instead, I met her stare, steady and unblinking. "Not me," I said quietly, but the words carried. "You destroyed something that was mine, something you never had the right to touch, and you thought no one would hold you accountable." The silence that followed wasn't the fearful hush Karen had commanded in the past. It was heavier, sharper, silence that judged, silence that condemned. A man in the back, Henderson with his cane, broke it first. His voice wavered, but didn't falter. "You went too far, Karen. We all saw it." The Morales boy chimed in, bolder. "You called our mom's flowers weeds once. Said you'd fine us if we didn't cut them down. She cried for days." Another voice. "You threatened us about a shed." Another. "You tried to ban kids from chalk drawings on the sidewalk." One by one, the stories surfaced, each sharper than the last, until the room became a chorus of grievances. It wasn't about my garden anymore. It was about years of quiet resentment, small humiliations, and abuses that everyone had carried in silence, until now. Karen slammed her binder shut, the sound like a gunshot. "This is mob rule," she shouted, her composure cracking. "You think you're so righteous, but without me, this place will fall apart. Property values will plummet. Crime will spread. I've protected you, and this is how you repay me." Paulson didn't flinch. "Mrs. Connors, this hearing isn't about speculation. It's about documented violations. The fines levied against you stand. The board has the authority to remove you from your position, and based on the evidence, the state supports that action." Her hands trembled as she clutched the binder to her chest. She tried to speak again, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time, Karen, the woman who had built her identity on unshakable dominance, looked small. The board chair, usually little more than Karen's echo, cleared his throat. He looked at her, then at the crowd, then back at his own papers. "The vote to remove Mrs. Connors from the board will be conducted immediately," he said. The ballot slips were passed around. Neighbors scribbled their marks with pens that shook, not from fear, but from release. Each paper dropped into the box sounded like the tolling of a bell. When the final tally was read, the result was unanimous. Karen was no longer president. She stood frozen, her binder clutched so tightly her knuckles whitened. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Then, with a sharp scrape of her chair, she turned and walked out of the hall. No one followed. No one called after her. The door shut behind her with a thud that echoed longer than it should have. The room stayed silent, but it was a different silence now. Not fear, not oppression. It was relief. Paulson gathered his papers, nodded once to the crowd, and left with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. And for the first time in years, I felt the neighborhood breathe. It happened on a Sunday evening, long after the chaos of the hearing had faded into a sort of uneasy silence across our neighborhood. The sun was slipping behind the ridge, casting the sky in burnt orange, and the crickets had just begun their nightly chorus. I was in my backyard again, what was left of it, where my wild garden had once stretched in vibrant rows. Now there were only patches of dirt, a few stubborn weeds pushing through the soil as if in protest against the destruction. I had started replanting in small ways. Potted herbs here, a scattering of wildflower seeds there. But it wasn't the same. My hands still itched to dig into the earth like before, but every time I knelt down, I felt the phantom ache of what had been stolen. That was when I heard a hesitant knock at my back gate. It was unusual. Most neighbors used the front, and anyone else would have simply called my name over the fence. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened it. It was Evelyn, the neighbor 3 houses down. She was in her mid-60s, usually quiet, always polite at HOA meetings, but rarely speaking. Tonight, however, her face was pale, her lips pressed tight as if she had been holding back words for years. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as though Karen herself might leap out from the shadows to silence her. "Can I come in?" she whispered. I nodded and stepped aside. Evelyn slipped inside, clutching a folded paper in her hand. She didn't sit. Instead, she hovered in the yard, eyes darting toward the ruined garden beds as if they carried ghosts. "I shouldn't even be here," she muttered. But after what happened at the hearing, after the way she lied, her voice trailed off. "What is it, Evelyn?" I asked gently. She looked at me with eyes full of guilt. "You deserve to know why Karen came after you." I thought I knew already. Power. Control. The usual poison Karen carried like perfume. But Evelyn shook her head when I said as much. "No, it wasn't just about control. It was about money. She's been eyeing your property for years. Your garden, she saw it as an obstacle to what she wanted." I frowned. An obstacle to what? Evelyn unfolded the paper she'd been holding. It was a copy of a letter, an official-looking one, printed on the letterhead of a real estate development firm I didn't recognize. She handed it to me, her hand trembling slightly. The letter outlined a rezoning proposal. If the lots on our side of the street were cleaned up and the HOA could present the neighborhood as uniform, marketable, and premium, Karen had a potential buyer lined up, a developer who wanted to convert parts of the neighborhood into luxury rentals. My house, my garden, was directly in the way. My stomach dropped as I read. The letter was dated months before the destruction. She didn't see your garden as a sanctuary, Evelyn whispered. She saw it as clutter, as a liability. She thought if she could strip it away, she'd have leverage to push the HOA board into approving the rezoning. She wanted to cash out big, raise the value of her property, and walk away richer than the rest of us. The words sank into me slowly, like ice water seeping into veins. For all the frustration Karen had caused, I had always assumed it was about ego, about her need to dominate every meeting, every rule, every blade of grass. But this was calculated, cold, ruthless. Why didn't anyone say anything? My voice was sharper than I intended. Evelyn's face fell. Fear. You've seen what she does when someone opposes her. The letters, the fines, the gossip. She makes life miserable until people give in. We were afraid. But when I saw her standing there at the hearing, acting like you were the problem, like she was the victim, I couldn't stay silent anymore. She lowered her gaze. And maybe I was tired of being a coward. I didn't know what to say. My chest felt tight, fury rising like wildfire. For years, Karen had pretended to care about the community. She'd masked her greed with rules about aesthetic and uniformity. But the truth was uglier. She was willing to destroy anything, or anyone, if it meant lining her pockets. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out another envelope. There's more. She's been keeping notes. Plans. I don't know how she thought she'd hide them forever, but I got copies. She doesn't know. Inside were HOA meeting drafts, never sent, never approved. In them, Karen had outlined strategies, labeling certain yards as non-compliant, targeting homes one by one, all under the guise of neighborhood improvement. My name had been at the top of her list for months. I could hardly breathe. She orchestrated everything. Evelyn nodded solemnly. She wanted you gone, or at least your garden gone, because it made the neighborhood look too wild, not profitable. And once she had you out of the way, the rest of us would have followed. One by one, silence fell between us. The crickets outside kept chirping, unaware of the storm that had just cracked open inside me. I finally asked, "Why now, Evelyn? Why tell me all this now?" Her shoulders sagged. Because the hearing won't be the end. Karen won't stop unless people know the truth. If you fight her, you'll need proof. And I can't watch her do this anymore. She looked at me with something like hope, something like desperation. You have to stop her. That night, long after Evelyn had gone home, I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread out before me. The pages rustled under the ceiling fan, whispering accusations. My hands shook, not with fear this time, but with a righteous anger. I thought back to every sneer Karen had given me, every time she called my garden messy, every HOA meeting where she turned neighbors against each other. It had never been about rules. It had never been about order. It was about greed dressed up as authority. And now, thanks to Evelyn, I finally had the truth. The next battle wouldn't be about fines or hearings. It would be about exposing Karen's obsession for what it truly was, financial corruption at the expense of everyone around her. But as I stared at the evidence, one thought wouldn't leave me. If she had been planning this for so long, what else was she willing to do to protect her plan? The first crack in Karen's empire came quietly, like the hairline fracture in a porcelain cup, almost invisible until the pressure made it shatter. At first, I thought the fine mailed to her was the end of the matter. Justice, small but symbolic. A reminder that she couldn't bulldoze through people's lives without consequence. But I had underestimated how deep her reach ran and how fragile her carefully constructed image really was. The investigation, what began as a few sternly worded complaints and a copy of state regulations mailed to the HOA office, spread like wildfire. Homeowners who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices. Anonymous letters landed in the mailbox of the inspector. Phone calls trickled into the county clerk's office. Whispers traveled faster than gossip ever had, and one by one, people stepped forward. It turned out I wasn't the only one she had wronged. The web of intimidation. Mrs. Holbrook, the widow 2 doors down, revealed that Karen had fined her $100 a week for unauthorized lawn ornaments. The ornaments? A pair of ceramic owls her late husband had bought her on their anniversary. The Patel family admitted that Karen had threatened to block their new driveway approval unless they contributed to a neighborhood beautification fund that no one could ever trace in the HOA's accounting books. Then came whispers about misuse of HOA funds, new security cameras billed at triple their market cost, landscapers who were paid but never showed up, invoices signed by Karen herself with no witnesses. She had controlled the neighborhood with a mix of vanity projects, selective punishment, and a keen sense of fear. Most people didn't fight back because the cost of resistance, lawyers, hearings, harassment, seemed worse than the offense. So they stayed silent. But silence has a shelf life. The turning tide. One evening, as I watered the fragile new sprouts I had managed to coax from my scarred soil, I noticed clusters of neighbors gathered in hushed conversation. They weren't avoiding me anymore. They were circling Karen's house like wary wolves who had finally realized the alpha was injured. At a hastily called HOA meeting, attendance overflowed into the street. People who hadn't bothered to come in years were suddenly there, holding folders of receipts, photos, and stories. Karen sat at the head of the long folding table, a porcelain smile plastered on her face, trying to project the authority that had once been unquestioned. But it was slipping, the way she shuffled her papers too quickly, the way her lips pressed thin when someone dared raise their voice. "This meeting is out of order," she declared when Mrs. Holbrook began recounting the fines about her owls. "No, Karen," a voice shot back from the crowd. Mr. Patel, usually soft-spoken. His hand shook as he held up a stack of photocopied checks. "You are out of order." The room erupted. The unraveling. The county investigation dug deeper than anyone expected. Auditors poured through years of HOA financial records. Line items that once seemed harmless revealed gaping holes. Landscaping contracts billed to companies that didn't exist. Reimbursements written to Karen's personal account under the label miscellaneous expenses. Thousands upon thousands of dollars gone. The very foundation of her control, the illusion of competence, of being the protector of neighborhood property values, crumbled. Legal notices began arriving at her doorstep, each envelope a blow to her pride. Neighbors who once flinched under her gaze now crossed the street to smirk at the growing stack on her porch. The intimidation had reversed direction. Her iron grip weakened with every sunrise. The house with the for sale sign. And then it happened. I woke one morning to the sound of hammers and stakes being driven into the lawn across the street. I thought, at first, it was just another project. Karen had always loved displays of activity, anything to show her dominance over the neighborhood's aesthetics. But when I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, I froze. A white post had been planted in her front yard. Hanging from it, swinging lightly in the breeze, was a brand-new for sale sign. I stared at it for a long time, the way one stares at a monument. The queen of the cul-de-sac, the woman who fined children for sidewalk chalk drawings, who policed the color of people's curtains, who stripped my garden down to sterile dirt, was leaving. It didn't feel real at first, but over the following days, the signs of collapse became impossible to miss. Realtors in polished suits came and went. Strangers toured her home, whispering as they glanced at the manicured hedges she once forced others to mimic. Moving trucks idled in her driveway. Curtains were drawn tighter, as though the house itself was ashamed. Whispers turned to cheers. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, began to breathe again. Children played in the street, without parents nervously glancing toward Karen's windows. Lawn ornaments reappeared, small, tentative at first, then proudly displayed. Bird feeders, colorful flags, even a plastic flamingo planted defiantly in one front yard. At night, I overheard laughter spilling from patios that had long been quiet. Neighbors who barely nodded to one another now shared drinks, trading stories of their run-ins with Karen as though comparing scars after a battle. She had ruled with whispers. Now whispers celebrated her downfall. The final glimpse. The last time I saw Karen was a gray Tuesday morning. I was kneeling in my garden, gently pressing fresh seeds into the soil that she had once stripped bare when the rumble of an engine made me look up. A moving truck pulled away from her house. Karen stood in the driveway, arms crossed, sunglasses shielding her eyes even though the sky was heavy with clouds. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no smile, no smugness, no thinly veiled threat, only exhaustion. Her empire had crumbled, and with it, the woman who once strutted through our cul-de-sac like royalty had become just another homeowner forced to flee the ruins of her own making. Without a word, she climbed into her car and drove away. Aftermath. The neighborhood didn't mourn. Instead, we held our first community barbecue in years. Tables lined the street, covered in homemade dishes, laughter ringing out where once there had only been tension. And as I stood there, watching children run past with sparklers and hearing the clink of glasses raised in quiet victory, I realized something. Karen had thought she was protecting property values. But what she destroyed was far more valuable. Trust, harmony, the simple joy of living in peace. With her gone, the soil of the neighborhood, like my garden, could finally breathe again. And maybe, just maybe, something beautiful would grow. Winter had passed slowly, quietly, the way grief lingers even after the tears stop. My yard was nothing but bare soil then, the frozen memory of what Karen had destroyed. Some days I avoided looking at it altogether, ashamed of the emptiness. Other days I stood at the window for long stretches, imagining how it once looked, the tall swaying grasses, the monarchs dancing across milkweed, the hummingbirds darting in for nectar. But time does what it always does. The ice melted, the ground softened, and with it, something inside me softened too. When spring came, I didn't rush outside with a shovel the way I once might have. Instead, I walked the perimeter, palms open, as if I were listening to the soil. I wanted to start right this time, not just rebuilding what was lost, but planting something stronger, something untouchable. It wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about memory, about defiance, about justice. The first Saturday of April, I pulled my old gloves from the garage. The fabric smelled faintly of earth and rain, even after all those months. I knelt down and touched the dirt. My hand shook, not from weakness, but from the weight of what it meant. This was more than gardening. This was reclaiming. I began with natives, the same species Karen had mocked as weeds. Milkweed, coneflower, goldenrod, little blue stem. I dug deep, deeper than before, making sure the roots would anchor in a soil that no iron hand could ever tear from me. Each plant was like a small act of defiance, a whisper to the earth. We're back. You tried to erase us, but we endure. That morning, I thought I would be alone, but I wasn't. The first knock came just as I was pressing soil around a sapling oak. It was Emily, my next-door neighbor. She stood there in gardening gloves, holding a flat of purple asters. "Figured you could use these," she said, not quite meeting my eyes at first. For years, she had stayed quiet during Karen's reign. Now, she seemed almost embarrassed about it. "I'd love that," I said, meaning it more than she probably knew. Within an hour, more neighbors trickled in. Dan from across the street brought mulch. The couple at the corner showed up with trowels. Even Mr. Lewis, who once pretended not to see when Karen ripped out my plants, arrived carrying a watering can and a tray of seedlings. One by one, they filled my yard, not as onlookers but as helpers. The sound of laughter mixed with the scrape of shovels and the thud of soil. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community instead of a kingdom under Karen's thumb. As we worked, stories spilled out, quiet confessions of the times Karen had bullied them, too. She had fined the Lewises for leaving holiday decorations up a day too long. She threatened Dan with legal action over his mailbox color. Emily admitted Karen once suggested she find a new neighborhood if she didn't like the rules. Every confession was like another crack in the statue of the queen who had once ruled us. She was gone now, her house standing empty with a fading for sale sign, but her shadow had lingered. Plant by plant, we were chasing it away. By mid-afternoon, the yard began to take shape. Flowers lined the walkway, grasses swayed in the breeze, and the oak tree stood proud in the corner, small but full of promise. Children ran between the rows, their laughter high and bright. It wasn't just my yard blooming again, it was all of us. When the last plant was in the ground, we stood together and admired it. My chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to joy. The air smelled of fresh soil, green life, and second chances. "Looks better than before," Mr. Lewis said quietly. I smiled. He was right. But the truth was, the beauty wasn't only in the flowers. It was in the hands that planted them, in the neighbors who had once stayed silent, now standing shoulder to shoulder. It was in the fact that Karen's face, frozen with shock as she clutched that vine, was only a memory now. That night, after everyone left, I stayed outside with the garden. The moon rose, casting silver light across the petals. The breeze stirred the grasses, and for a moment, I swore I heard whispers, not from ghosts, but from the earth itself. "Thank you. We are home again." I watered each plant slowly, carefully, as though baptizing them into a new chapter. Drops sparkled like tiny stars under the moonlight. And as I stood there, I realized something. The garden wasn't mine alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who had fought quietly, everyone who had endured Karen's rule, everyone who believed that beauty deserved to live. Every bloom, every blade of grass was proof that some things can't be erased. Not by arrogance, not by rules, not even by destruction. Karen had thought she could uproot me. Instead, she had uprooted herself. The queen of the cul-de-sac was gone. But the garden was eternal. I half expected Karen to knock on my door one day. Not immediately, of course. Pride doesn't surrender that easily. But some part of me imagined that, after the dust settled, after the fines had been paid and the HOA meetings dissolved into smaller, quieter gatherings, she might show up. Maybe she'd have an envelope in her hand, or maybe just a trembling voice. Perhaps she'd explain, perhaps she'd beg for forgiveness, or at least admit she had gone too far. But she never did. No footsteps ever echoed on my porch. No hesitant knock ever rattled my doorframe. There were no flowers left at my gate. No anonymous notes slipped beneath my mat. Karen vanished the same way shadows do at noon, suddenly, without ceremony. Her house, once pristine and patrolled by her critical eye, was sold quietly. One morning, I noticed the for sale sign out front, and by the time the season changed, a young family had moved in. They planted daisies in the front yard. Simple, unpretentious daisies, cheerful splashes of yellow and white that swayed with the breeze. The kind of flowers that didn't demand perfection, didn't boast superiority, but simply existed for joy. And in that choice of bloom, it felt like the street itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Neighbors who once avoided my gaze began to stop in their tracks. Some would linger on their morning walks just to admire the new life sprouting from my soil. Others offered nods that softened into waves, and eventually, the tentative waves turned into conversations. "The yard looks beautiful again," they'd say. "You've really made this place special." Their words weren't just compliments on flowers or landscaping. They were acknowledgments, subtle apologies wrapped in neighborly kindness. It felt as if the street had shed a heavy shadow. But still, when I passed Karen's old home, my thoughts betrayed me. I'd glance at the windows, the porch railings, the shutters that once framed her watchful eyes. I couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere far away, she ever regretted it. Did she think of the day the letter arrived in her mailbox, the one that froze her in place? Did she replay the courtroom-like tension of HOA meetings, where her authority unraveled thread by thread? Did she see herself as the aggressor, or did she rewrite the story in her mind, painting herself as the victim of an ungrateful neighborhood and an uncooperative neighbor? Regret is a strange thing. It doesn't always manifest in words or gestures. Sometimes it lingers as silence, as absence, as the weight of something unspoken. Karen's silence was louder than any apology could have been. It left a hollow space in the story, a blank page that I knew would never be filled. And yet, there were nights when I imagined what she might have said if she had come. Maybe she would have stood stiffly on my porch, arms folded, unable to soften. Her voice would be clipped. I didn't mean for it to go that far. Or perhaps she would have wept, the mask of superiority finally cracking, revealing the loneliness beneath. Maybe she would have whispered, I was wrong. I just want to control, and I let it consume me. I'll never know if those words ever crossed her mind, but the absence of them carried its own meaning. Life on the street went on. Children rode bikes past her old house, their laughter spilling over fences. The young family who replaced her hosted weekend barbecues, the scent of grilled food drifting across yards where once there had been only tension and whispered complaints. For the first time in years, people sat on their porches again, waving freely, sharing stories that had nothing to do with fines or bylaws. The garden became more than mine. It became the neighborhood's pulse, a reminder that something broken could bloom again. When the daisies across the street nodded toward my native plants, it felt like a conversation, soft, wordless, but full of meaning. Still, there was a ghost at the edge of it all. Karen's ghost. Not her physical presence, but the imprint she had left. The way people hesitated before speaking too freely. The way some glanced at her old house, as if expecting her to reappear, clipboard in hand, ready to tally infractions no one else cared about. Her absence was freedom, yes, but also a scar, a reminder of what unchecked control could do to a community. I learned something in her silence. Apologies aren't always given. Sometimes, you carry the wound without closure. Sometimes, the person who hurt you never acknowledges the damage, never hands you the balm of their regret, and you must learn to help without it. So I did. Every time I watered the soil, I thought of Karen's frozen face holding that fine. Not with bitterness, not even with triumph anymore, but with clarity. The garden wasn't just mine. It was proof. Proof that some things cannot be erased, no matter how forcefully someone tries. Proof that the earth remembers, that roots run deeper than control, that beauty can return even after destruction. Karen never apologized. She never asked for forgiveness. But in the quiet bloom of daisies across the street, and in the stronger, wilder roots of my own garden, I found the apology I never received. It wasn't hers, it was life's. Seasons turned, and my garden grew wilder, stronger, more alive than before. Butterflies returned. Children ran through the flowers. Even the air smelled different. I realized then it was never just about plants. It was about standing firm when someone tried to strip away what you built. Karen thought she had erased me. But in truth, she only made my roots deeper. And as the sun fell over the blossoms, I smiled. The fight was over. The garden had won.